My name is Nancy, and I'm with On Point TV. We are continuing our series in the block by block Quilt as you go. So if you haven't seen any of the previous videos, we're taking you through this book by Beth Donaldson. Now the book is no longer in print, so you're going to have to find it on eBay or at your quilt guild or call all of your best quilting buddies, see if anybody has the Quilt as you go book from Beth Donaldson. In the last episode, we assembled the blocks together. I've taken you through the process of designing the quilt, appli-quilting, the quilting, and putting the blocks together. Now it's time to put a row together. Now we're kind of lucky. This quilt only has 4 blocks, so we only have to do this across 4, although they are rather large blocks if I say so myself. But just know that when you're working on a quilt that's larger, you're going to have larger rows as you go. It's no more difficult of a process than putting the blocks together, but as you can imagine, a quilt is heavier than a block, so it can be a little bit heavy working, so you're going to get a little bit of strength workout in the process. So this is in our quilt our second row, block 3 and block 4, and this is block 1 and 2. So on block 1 and 2, the bottom, I've got this tipped upside down, but the bottom, which is the row, the sashings that is going to connect to block 3 and 4, this is where I did not completely quilt this sashing. Because I only did straight lines, I stopped right here. When I turn this over, I've prepared it by bringing the batting and the backing away from the sashing, the quilt top. And that's exactly how I did it with the blocks themselves. Now it's time to assemble. So I'm now going to pin the sashings from this section to the entire quilt on the bottom section. You want to match up your sashing sections. I like to use some bigger pins here when possible, because this is such a thick piece that you're pinning. Sometimes your normal pins just might not be strong enough. Come to the edge, match up my cornerstones to my sashing, and then in between I'll put quite a few pins here because, like I said with the blocks, the bottom piece, because it's already quilted, is a little bit smaller than the sashing. Doesn't mean the sashing's not the right size. It's just that when you do quilted sections to non-quilted sections, the sections that are not quilted yet are going to be a little bit bigger. But we'll be able to ease that as we assemble this. And then to the last one, again matching up the sashings. And I'll continue to put the pins in here, and then we'll go back to the sewing machine. So now we're ready to assemble the rows, the first row to the second row. So like we did the blocks. Now again, if you missed on how we did the blocks, go back one video. It's right there. You'll see us assemble the blocks. So I'm coming here, and I've got my machine set up with a normal 1/4 of an inch, not a scant 1/4 of an inch. Just something about having that extra distance really helps. And as I'm going over the pins, I'm going over nice and slow, because you really don't want to move the pins. You need them to stay in place so that everything is right where you wanted it to be. Now this is a section where we had to ease that sashing in, so I like to kind of hold it from the back and the front and kind of gently pull it without hurting the machine, first of all, but also not preventing the machine from going forward. If you do not have a FAF sewing machine, now this is a FAF sewing machine with the built-in walking foot on the back, this would be done with your large walking foot in place, which can make visibility a little bit, just honestly, it's just going to be harder to see. But just know that if you can move your needle over to get that scant 1/4 inch, you'll be fine. But do the 1/4 inch from the edge of your walking foot. So it'll be a different measurement than you normally use when you're doing your quilt piecing. Make sure that my seams stay in the direction I want them to go. And I'm going to the second block now. It gets a little bit heavy, and it'll get very heavy when you're working on a larger quilt, but it's doable. It's always going to be easier than quilting a very large quilt. And coming to the end. And cut off. Now we're going to go and fold these over to create our backing seam. So we've done the stitching of the sashing to the bottom set of blocks, and I'm going to remove these pins. This is my fabulous pincushion. If you ever have not noticed, this is Nancy's fabulous pincushion. Pattern and kits available on the website www.onpoint-tv. There was a little bit of commercialism there, but you know, you got to sell something every once in a while. Now we're going to open this up, and I need to press this seam. So to get this seam to completely press open, as I'm pressing it, I'm going to pull the quilt away. So hold the quilt and pull it away. Give it a little burst of steam. Get a little bit more space here. There. Now we're going to trim the batting. So for the trimming of the batting, we want to trim the batting so that it trims to be even with the seam. So if you look at the seam here, I want the batting to butt right up to it. So it'll go right there. So I'll use my cool curved scissors. And as you're going, you're just going to butt the batting to that seam and then trim. So it takes a little time. Take your time. Don't go too fast. You really don't want to cut this too short, so be cautious of that. If anything, cut it a smidge bigger. At least you'd be able to trim off a little bit more if you did that. So now the batting is butt right up next to the last block, and I'm going to use the fusible tape. So this is the heat press black fusible tape. This is what you use for putting layers of batting together. Marti Michell also has her own fusible tape. It's a tricot, so it has a little bit of stretch to it with the fusible on the back side. It holds these together so nicely. So if you're ever wanting to, you've got scraps of batting laying around in your studio, you can take those scraps, butt them together, and use this to hold them together, and you're making yourself a whole new big piece of batting. So I'm going to take this fusible side down, and I want to position it so that it is just less than the seam that I sewed this block together with, or this row together with. I want it to be there, but I don't want it to stick out past that seam. If it sticks out past that seam, I'd end up seeing it, which honestly is why I use the black instead of the white. This is available in white and in black from Heat Press, and I really like the black and the white depending on what you're doing. And in this case, I thought that if the black went outside the seam where I want it, it wouldn't be quite as noticeable. So be sure that when you're doing this, that you've pulled so that your sashing is completely flat and that it's nice, nice and straight. Having a little bit of a time with my iron and my ironing board being this high. It's not normally this high. All right, I'm just about to the end. I'm gonna cut this off. I'm always surprised how quickly this iron is down too. You don't have to be patient with your iron. You just iron, it just works. It sticks. Move those out of the way. And now it's time to fold the backing down. So coming back to the other end again. Now in this particular piece, you know what? I had left a little bit of the selvage on. I am going to get rid of that. So just tear off a little bit of that sashing that was left on that block. Don't ever want the sashing left. Let me press that flat again. There. So when you're doing this, you want to take and the backing itself needs to be folded over a half of an inch plus a little bit more. So it's not an exact half of an inch. So it does not work very well if you pre-press it. So when you're doing this, I'm actually a little bit, I'm not going to be able to go under a half inch. I must have had not quite enough trimmed on this one as I wanted. So I'm going to have to be, I'll have about a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, which is still going to be fine. But I don't have that half inch I was just telling you about. I'm going to press it so that it goes just over the line of stitching that is holding this row together. When I sew this down, it'll make sense as to why I went just over that line. Once you get this folded into place down the entire row, now you can use some of your Roxanne's basting glue, which is right over here, right where I put it. And you can put some dots of glue right inside that seam line. So instead of putting pins down, the Roxanne's glue will hold it in place really nice and flat and very, very secure, so you won't have to be dealing with pins as you go. So put that down. It's covering up the seam line just like I wanted it to. And then press it down to make it dry a little bit faster. And I'll do this all the way down to the row and then back to the sewing machine. So our rows are now ready to be stitched. And this is what I want to show you in a really good close-up. I was talking about how the fold here needs to cover up that stitching line. So there's just a little bit of that stitching line, and you see how when the fold covers it, you can see none of the stitching line. That's very important because of where we're going to be doing the stitching. Now I'm not going to start on the end because I will do a different quilting design in the yellow, but I'm coming down here to the blue. I will be stitching on what I call on the ledge. So it's not on the white, and it's just maybe 3 or 4 threads up on the ledge of the blue. And if you think about where it is that we did that fold, that will mean that we are catching just a little bit past that fold. And the quilt is getting a little bit bigger, so you've got to be manhandling the quilt a little bit more to get it to go where you want it to go. But again, it's still better than trying to quilt the entire queen-size quilt all in one big piece, which is why people love the block by block and quilt as you go techniques. So I'm coming to the end of the block here, so I'm going to take just a few smaller stitches and then cut my thread. And I would skip over the yellow and continue on down. But I do want to come back and quilt the rest of the sashing. If I was doing free motion quilting, I'd actually do whatever my free motion design is here. But for this particular sashing design, I've chosen just to do a straight line around down in the middle. So I want to move my needle over a little bit to be back to center. You can edit that. Come on, come on. There. So I'm back to the middle, and I'm just going to eye it. I don't need to draw a line. If you wanted to draw a line, you certainly could. Do a little bit of a locking stitch there, and then I'm just going to eye it right down the middle of this last little sashing. To the end, do a little bit of some tiny stitches there for my locking stitch, and cut my thread. So we've taken the time to put our blocks together, and we just finished putting our rows together. I do need to do a little bit of quilting inside of the yellow cornerstones, but I'll do that on my other machine. When we come back next time, we will be putting the borders on the block by block. What I want you to know about the borders is that you can do this to make any quilt you're making a little bit larger. It's really quite fun, and it comes from Marti Michell's book, Machine Quilting in Sections. If you like this episode, I hope you give us a thumbs up. I really like a good thumbs up now and again. And if you want to find out when we're doing any other recordings, when we upload things, or when we do any live videos, be sure you subscribe to our channel and hit the notifications button. If you have any questions, you can always email me at quiltingwithnancy@gmail.com. I'll see you next time.